Welcome in to another edition of the DLF Dynasty podcast. I am Dan Myler with Ryan McDowell and Matt Price. The regular season, guys, is in the books. We're getting ready for postseason football. This week, we're already turning the clock, turning the page over to the off-season mode here on the DLF Dynasty podcast, as many dynasty managers are doing right now, Ryan. It's time to start thinking about building teams for next season, the NFL draft, everything that happens in the off season. Our minds are on that. We're over this whole 2021 NFL season, right?
Yeah, absolutely. The playoffs should be fun, but yeah, as far as fantasy goes, as far as dynasty goes, definitely moving on, looking ahead, ready to really dive into the rookie class of 2022 and everything else that goes along with the offseason.
Matt, Ryan mentioned it. The postseason is going to be fun as a football fan, especially for us Packers fans, number one seed and all. But Dynasty is always on our minds, and we really couldn't wait to get into off-season mode.
Yeah, we've got all the information we're going to get from this season, so it's really time to start solidifying our opinions on players, tearing them up like we're going to do today, and start figuring out what we're going to do for the puzzle in 2022. It's a new puzzle every single year. Different players are going to be league winners next season, and we want to make sure we can acquire those players at a good price.
Yeah, so like Matt said, we will do the consensus ranking episodes as we have for the last few seasons coming out of the regular season. Consensus tiers, really. And we thought it appropriate to talk about the running backs first. Now, before we get into that, guys, I do have to say, the three of us have been talking a lot about the podcast and how we do things. We're inching closer to the 500th episode of the DLF Dynasty podcast. We got some stuff scheduled for that. That's going to be a fun listen for our listeners, fun for us to do as well. And then some tweaks, some changes that we're really excited to bring to our audience as well. But before we get to any of that, we need to do episode 497 before we can get to 500 or 501. Let's get into these running back consensus tier rankings. And we went through all the veterans. We're not throwing any of the incoming rookie class in there just yet. We always wait until we have all the declarations to start talking about those kinds of guys. There's still some news trickling in on that, and we're excited to bring you all that information as it comes out. But first, we're going to really talk about these veterans, and it starts at the top in tier 1. And guys, it was a clean sweep. We only put one player in there, Matt. All three of us put the same guy. It's JT, Jonathan Taylor, consensus number 1 running back, consensus single tier of just Jonathan Taylor.
Yeah, there's no other real choice right now. That said, if I had Jonathan Taylor, just based on my personal dynasty strategy, I might consider trying to move off of him at this point. Try to move into one of those top receivers, something like that. A player that's going to be a little bit potentially safer, as we go through this offseason. We know what happens to running backs, whether it's from the workload that they went through during the season, and the pileup that could happen on the entry to the following season. So with Taylor right now, I know he's probably the most valuable player in all of Dynasty in one quarterback leagues anyway. But because of that position that he plays, there's a good chance I would be looking to move off of him if I was on a team that, if he was on a team of mine that was even like a middle of the road. If I was an absolute top tier contender, and I was pretty sure even if something was to happen to Taylor, I'd be competitive, then that's the kind of team I would hold on to him. But if I'm anywhere from the middle of the road or worse, I think at this point I'm happy to try to get max value for him.
Yeah, I'm actually on board with that as well, especially. You mentioned middle of the pack. If you don't think you're that strong contender, really every single season, certainly this year and next year, then I'm fine moving Taylor as well and selling high. But just looking at him, only 22 years old. He is the number 1 player right now in our ADP, not just the number 1 running back. But I remember earlier in the season having a conversation about the top players at each position, and there was an argument among quarterbacks. Mahomes was struggling at that point. There was an argument among wide receivers. Is it Chase? Is it Jefferson, or maybe even one of the other young receivers. And even at that time, there was a conversation between Taylor and a few others. I mean, some people were even putting DeAndre Swift as the RB1 at that point earlier this season. But I think of looking across the four positions, this is the one that's locked in. No argument at all. I can't imagine even somebody having somebody like Christian McCaffrey as the RB1. It's got to be Taylor, tier of his own.
Yeah, it's difficult to make that case for anybody but Taylor with that run he had in the middle of the season. Although he maybe let us down the last couple of weeks of the regular season, he's just so dynamic, and it's hard to see him breaking down physically. He's so young and he's so gifted. If he could just add, I read a stat, guys, earlier this week that Jonathan Taylor finished 2021 as the RB1 in fantasy with the least amount of catches since 2008. So he's doing it in PPR leagues without the added benefit of those catches that we get from some of those other top tier or traditional top tier running backs, the Christian McCaffreys and the Dalvin Cooks and Alvin Kamara's of years past. Taylor's got to do it without the pass catching. So it's still something, we said it at the beginning of the year, we were hoping for 2 or 3 catches a game, and that kind of disappeared in the middle of the season. It started off strong, but we got away from that in Indianapolis, and hopefully they can refine that part of their offense, because he's, as he showed a few times, taking screens long distance, that he could be very dynamic as a pass catcher as well. So tier 2, that's another smaller tier, but not quite as small as the Jonathan Taylor tier up there at the top. There are 3 consensus guys, Ryan, in tier 2. It's DeAndre Swift, it's Christian McCaffrey, and it's Javonte Williams. No matter which order you have those 3 guys, they all seem to belong in tier 2.
Yeah, I think they certainly do. Of course, we know what McCaffrey can give us when he's on the field, and I mean, if he is healthy, he's closer to tier 1 than he is to the other veterans later that we'll get to. And then you have these relative newcomers, the rookie Williams, the second-year player in Swift. And we're excited about their upside. Obviously, their age, what we have seen from them so far, that's what pushes them up the board this highly, I think. And Williams, Javonte Williams, is really going to be kind of the hot button player of the offseason, I think. Many, obviously, the 3 of us have him as a top 5 dynasty running back, and some because he's shared the backfield, because he didn't put up those RB1 weeks so often that Taylor and so many others did, are kind of discounting him. And I think that's, honestly, I think that's foolish. You've got to look ahead a little bit. Melvin Gordon's a free agent. He's going to be gone. I think we can say that with certainty. And I also think that offense as a whole is going to be upgraded. We know that the Broncos are moving on from Vic Fangio as their head coach, and we're hoping they finally get that quarterback that can help the entire offense.
We really need that leap from Javonte Williams that we saw from DeAndre Swift, Matt. Swift came out like gangbusters early in the season and got dynasty rankers like ourselves thinking about him as a top 10 running back, as a top 5 running back, as a top 2 running back even. He came back late in the season. They kind of held his hand through those last couple of games where he was active. But the expectation with Swift, Matt, has to be that he'll get back into that lead dog role. He'll be the bell cow of that offense once again in Detroit in 2022.
Yeah. For me, this tier is the upside of McCaffrey when he's healthy, and then a bunch of young guys that have, I would say, less question marks than the next tier, but more question marks than Jonathan Taylor. And for me with Swift, the question is, he's never been that full-time bell cow back, at least for an extended period of time, and remained healthy doing so. So that's the question with him. Is he an Austin Eckler light, that kind of player? Maybe he's better than Austin Eckler, just younger. And so that's why we have him a tier in this tier 2 section. And then Javonte, like Ryan said, we're just waiting for Melvin Gordon to get out of the way. I think we've seen everything we need to see with him from an ability standpoint and what he can do in the NFL. And then CMC, we just need you to be on the field, bud. He could if he stays healthy all next season, he could absolutely be the running back one again. So that kind of discount, if you can get that kind of discount for him from an owner that's just tired of the nonsense, he's somebody that I'm going to be looking to add to my roster this off season, just for that potential upside. And we know it could certainly backfire as it did this year for people that traded for him during his injured stretch. But we know what he can do when he is on the field for our lineup. So it's those three pretty easily. And then Brian and I have another guy, Harris, who I think he fits with Javonte and DeAndre Swift. I think you don't have him here, Dan, but and I understand that. I'm not super excited about his talent, but he has been the running back for this season. He's had up and down pass game usage, but we can't deny the volume he's going to get, and he's remained relatively healthy with a full-time role. So I think that's enough for me to put him at this tier, but certainly at the bottom of this tier.
I did notice, and I think back to the offseason and the preseason, one big knock against DeAndre Swift was that we just knew the Lions were going to be so bad. And they were. I don't know how much that impacted him or impacted the running game in general, but you look at these players we've talked about so far: Jonathan Taylor, Javonte Williams, Swift, and McCaffrey. All of those teams were bad this year, relatively bad. Of course, the Colts just miss out on the playoffs. The other three teams were not really all that close. So I don't know that it means much, but it's kind of interesting that we're looking at these highest valued running backs in Dynasty, and their teams, at least at this moment, aren't particularly good.
So the reason I left Najee Harris out of that second tier wasn't really necessarily about the talent, because he makes some plays that will make you drop your jaw. The one-handed catches out of the backfield, he makes people miss in the backfield. It's really about the surrounding cast. There's so many questions about the quarterback position. There's questions about that offensive line. Really, all the way across that offensive line, they have problems that they need to address in the offseason. But because they have some issues on the defensive side of the ball and at quarterback, it's just such an unknown. Are they going to be able to address all those problems that they have across that front five? And that affects how Najee Harris can perform on the field. So many times we went into a week expecting RB1 numbers, and he was bottled up because of the limitations of the entire offense. And I just don't see how that gets better. It's going to be very difficult with the Steelers picking in the second half of the first round in the draft, and Ben moving on, I think most likely at the very least, for them to upgrade the position. We all say so much about Ben and the lack of production and how he looked like an older quarterback throughout this season, but I have a hard time seeing them having a better quarterback in 2022 than the aging Ben Roethlisberger of 2021. And that affects how I feel about Najee Harris.
I agree with you, but we're keeping Swift up this high, and we're dealing with players like Tim Boyle, starting for a decent chunk of the season. So I just don't know that the 2022 Steelers without Ben and an offensive line problem is going to be that much worse for a running back who's very good out of the backfield as a receiver. So I think that's where we're going to be relying on him until the team does get better. But that doesn't mean I think that he doesn't have significant PPR value, at least as much as DeAndre Swift does at this point. And he's proven that he can stay healthier to this point in their NFL career than Swift.
So again,
oh, go ahead.
Sorry, Dan. It's the same thing with all of these players. There's quarterback questions with Javonte Williams, with DeAndre Swift, with McCaffrey, and honestly, after week 17, maybe even with Jonathan Taylor as well. All of those teams could be looking to make a change potentially at quarterback.
Yeah, they're really tier 2 is. There's concerns with each of them. And even like you mentioned, Jonathan Taylor, there are small concerns there too. That's why I had such a problem drawing the line between tier 2 and tier 3. I considered Najee Harris very strongly and ended up drawing the line right before him. That ends up making our consensus tier DeAndre Swift, Javonte Williams, Christian McCaffrey, and Najee Harris. But then there's a handful more names that feel like they belong very, very close with Harris and the other three. And that starts off with some of the guys that the veteran running backs that have been top 5 running backs recently, guys like Dalvin Cook, Alvin Kamara, Joe Mixon, and Derrick Henry. All those guys feel like they're going to be top 10, top 12 producers next year. Now, we all know that the turnover in the top 10 or top 12 at running back it changes rapidly from year to year. So we can't just throw these guys' names in. But those guys, Cook, Kamara, Mixon, and Henry, along with Austin Eckler and Nick Chubb, those guys all fall into tier 3 for all of us. I'm just wondering, guys, how close were those names, Ryan, to jumping into tier 2 for you?
Well, you're right. It could almost be viewed as one huge tier from McCaffrey and Javonte Williams down to those players like Saquon Barkley, Antonio Gibson, even. The separation for me, where I really drew the line, is I thought of that top 5 group, and for me that was Taylor, Williams, Swift, McCaffrey, Harris, as dynasty assets. Meaning, I'm fairly confident at this point they all have multiple year value in 2022 and beyond. After that, I'm not sure. After that, I start treating it almost like a redraft, thinking about the value of those players 1 year at a time. That's why I've got Derrick Henry currently as my RB6, 28 years old, coming off the injury. That might be a surprise to value him over Eckler or Cook or Kamara or Mixon. But I started thinking about a 2022 redraft. And I think Jonathan Taylor's probably the number 1 pick, and maybe we'll see a couple wide receivers there. But I think there's a real chance the RB2 in a redraft league is Derrick Henry.
Yeah, and all these guys that we're talking about here, Cook, Mixon, Kamara, Henry, even Eckler and Chubb, it's not like we're talking about 30-year-old running backs right here. Mixon's 25, Eckler's 26, Cook is as well. And that's just a year older than Christian McCaffrey, who hasn't played more than a handful of games the last 2 seasons. So I like what you said there, thinking about that redraft philosophy. When you get beyond that youth, and I think that's the main reason, Matt, that I had Swift and Williams in that tier above these guys, especially those names, just because they have more of a long view. And I might be making a mistake, or we as a group might be making a mistake, because these other guys, we're talking about 26-year-olds. I know we usually want to get out on these guys, but there's a good chance we're looking at a 2 to 3 year window of high-end production out of all these names.
Yeah, I agree with you, but I think for me, it comes back to that weird thing we were talking about at the beginning, where we don't mind moving Jonathan Taylor because of the position. And the guys in this tier, for me, how I kind of separate them out was the formerly elite, or maybe even still elite veterans who, one bad injury, one bad season, and their value is going to, we're looking at Melvin Gordon. You know what I mean? Like that. If Dalvin Cook comes out, gets hurt for a year, or just has a bad season, then we're looking at a Melvin Gordon type value. And I think the cliff for these guys is much steeper for the guys in tier 1 and tier 2. And then I had a couple other guys that thrown in there too that kind of fit the theme, like J.K. Dobbins and Cam Akers. I could easily see both of those guys, if they had just come off of a healthy second season, they would probably be in tier 2 for us. But there's enough question mark there. Akers looks good coming back. Dobbins is probably going to look good coming back. But there's enough separation there for me to move him down a tier. And then one guy for me that didn't really fit at all in tier 2 and kind of doesn't really fit with this rest of this group in tier 3 is Antonio Gibson. We've seen him be productive today and productive at times when there has been a pass catching back on the field. We've seen that part of his game suffer a little bit. Same quarterback issues, same not great surroundings issues. So he doesn't quite fit in that tier 2, but there's not enough questions surrounding him to drop him to tier 4 either. So he's kind of an outlier in this tier for me. I wasn't really quite sure where to put him, but based on age, based on number of years left, unless we just think that, he's not good enough to be a multi-year starter, that's the only really concern I could see moving him down to tier 4. So a bunch of veterans, a couple of young guys with injury question marks, and then Gibson, who's kind of, I don't know, we talk about tiers all of their own, like we have at the top. Maybe Gibson is between tier 2 and the rest of these guys in tier 3 for me.
Well, the three of us all had Antonio Gibson in this tier. He certainly belongs as far as the three of us go, and names like J.K. Dobbins and Cam Akers, even Saquon Barkley, they're all added to tier 3 for all of us as well. That, you know, it feels like there is a difference between those names I just mentioned, though, and Dalvin Cook, Mixon, Kamara, Eckler, and Chubb. And, you know, that's where I really struggled. If we were going to really break it down into about 10 or 12 names here in tier 3, if maybe that couldn't be separated with those veterans that you mentioned there, Matt, and then the younger guys that have already had these injuries, like Akers and Dobbins, like Gibson, who had a second season full of injury, although he was on the field for most of it. And Saquon Barkley, who since his rookie season has not been the same kind of back as Cook and Mixon and Kamara, Eckler and Chubb. So I think there's a case, at least, Ryan, to be made that there should be a separating point in here. Obviously, we all decided they belong together. It's just an interesting topic.
Yeah, I actually did separate them initially, leaving Akers, Dobbins, Gibson down in the next tier. With basically the veterans, most of them being 26 years old in this third tier. But ultimately, I think we've got questions about those players, those three second-year backs, of course, most of those being health-related. We've talked about it on here before, and I would even put Barkley in that group with Akers, Dobbins, Gibson. If they come out in 2022 and they prove they're healthy, they're going to jump up to that second tier. They're going to leapfrog Henry, Mixon, Eckler, Cook, all of those guys very quickly. At least
it really feels that way. There are a couple other names that we haven't mentioned that either one or two of us have added to tier 3. And I think we should start with Ezekiel Elliott, Ryan. I'll make the case that I have. And it was simple. I feel like if we're going to have Saquon Barkley in a tier, we have to have Ezekiel Elliott in the same tier. Age, all the things that we care about, age, production, contract, offense that they play in, there's a case to be made that Zeke's in a better position than Saquon Barkley in all of those. So it felt to me that Zeke belonged here. I know you had him in tier 3 as well. I'm wondering what made you think that Zeke belongs in tier 3 with some of these other names.
Essentially that was a big piece of it. Okay. You look at these guys in this tier: Eckler, Cook, Kamara, Zeke, and Nick Chubb are all 26 years old. So there's not an age gap here that we're worried about Zeke. Honestly, he's been healthier, more healthy than the majority of those players, and he's been just as productive. He's had 7 RB1 games this year, 4 RB2 games. And then when you think big picture, you think about those offenses. We're talking about the Chargers, Vikings, Saints, Cowboys, Browns. I'm certainly most confident in the Dallas Cowboys and what their offense can do. They were one of the top scoring teams this year. I expect them to be the same next year, obviously giving Zeke and that entire offense more opportunities. So not only do I think he belongs in the tier, I think there's a strong case that he should be valued ahead of all those other players we're talking about, being Kamara, Cook, Eckler.
Sure. Yeah. I noticed you have him in the top 10 in your running back ranking still. I don't mind that ranking at all. I love that he plays through injury. He ran hard, even though he was playing with that brace and, you know, clearly playing through injury. He's a dog. He likes to work. And I like those kinds of running backs on my team, even as he kind of moves into his late 20s. I especially like what he did the last few weeks of the regular season. I'm looking forward to seeing him run in the postseason. The last name we need to mention, Matt, in tier 3 is Packers running back Aaron Jones. Now, you and I both had him included in tier 3, and there's a big conversation to be had about how A.J. Dillon has affected his value. The thing is, Aaron Jones continues to put up numbers despite A.J. Dillon. Aaron Jones continues to do it with less touches every single game. And if we're going to talk about offenses that we want a piece of, Aaron Jones in Green Bay is a big one. So what made Jones a part of this tier for you? And if you're going to include Jones, because we've talked about him alongside A.J. Dillon all season long, what kept A.J. Dillon out of tier 3 for you?
I think there's a fine argument for them to be back-to-back and rankings are in the same tier, but I just think that as long as these two are both in Green Bay, Aaron Jones is going to be the primary pass catcher. I know we've seen Dillon catch plenty of passes this season, more than we maybe expected, but I just from that perspective, especially if we have a new quarterback, if it's not Aaron Rodgers, hopefully it's not Jordan Love, if it's an offense that has a quarterback who is limited in what they can do downfield, then the check down back is going to be Aaron Jones, I think, a lot of the time. So it's really just that PPR aspect. But I think that's not a great argument. So I could see moving Dillon up. I could see moving Jones down. I'm not super tied to this. I guess I just have more confidence in Jones. They've paid him. We know he's going to be there. The production is probably going to be a little bit inconsistent, as we have seen at times this season and really throughout his career. So I don't mind either way. I just think that he's at this point still the more valuable player from a production standpoint.
I tend to agree as well. I had Jones ahead of Dillon and a tier separator between the two as well. Jones, he really played well early in the season. He got a lot more opportunities.
And late.
And as the weather got colder and as the Packers needed that ground and pound attack late in games, late in the season, they've switched a little bit towards Dillon. It feels to me like that was their plan from the beginning, in good weather, for Aaron Jones to be the primary guy. And as things kind of switched in Green Bay, they've gone to Dillon a little bit, and it's working for the Packers. I'm not sure it works for all of us as dynasty managers, however. Before we move on to tier 4, we should put a bow on this tier. We ended up with a pretty big one right here. It's Dalvin Cook, Joe Mixon, Alvin Kamara, Austin Eckler, Nick Chubb, Saquon Barkley, Cam Akers, J.K. Dobbins, Derrick Henry, Antonio Gibson, Ezekiel Elliott, and Aaron Jones. So a large tier in tier 3. Let's talk about our friends over at Monkey Knife Fight, the daily fantasy sports for the rest of us. Even if you've played DFS in the past, your experience with Monkey Knife Fight will feel completely different. No more competing against professional players or working through time-consuming salary caps. With Monkey Knife Fight, you choose from unique, easy-to-play games, including the popular More or Less contests, where you can bet on if your favorite NFL player will have more or less yards than predicted. You can also play all of the other major sports, as well as golf, UFC, NASCAR, and more. Sign up for a new account with Monkey Knife Fight with a first-time deposit and receive a full year of DLF premium for free. In addition, Monkey Knife Fight will match the deposit total up to $100 with the promo code DLF. That's it. That's all you have to do. Your DLF subscription is going to be set up within 36 hours, and you'll have access to everything we have to offer. So go log on to dynastyleaguefootball.com, click the image for Monkey Knife Fight, and follow the instructions to get started today. Let's jump into tier 4, guys. This was another questionable tier for me. I ended up with a real small list of 3 players. And there were only 2 really between the 3 of us that we had as consensus tier 4 running backs. The aforementioned A.J. Dillon, Ryan, and then rookie running back Elijah Mitchell from San Francisco. Those 2 are in. But how did you go about building tier 4? What were your thoughts while trying to build these guys? I know you had Aaron Jones in here as well.
Yeah, for me it was pretty clear that none of those 3 that I ranked in that tier, being Jones, Dillon, and Mitchell, belonged in that group with some players that I simply think at this point have higher upside and more value. So I didn't want to move them up. We'll get to tier 5 soon, but there's, for me, a lot of question marks in tier 5. So like you said, I ended up with a small tier of players that I feel pretty good about, but certainly still have some questions. I really think Mitchell, I mentioned the rookie Javonte Williams being a player I think is going to be hotly debated this offseason. I think Mitchell will as well. Honestly, I've seen some people ranking him as an RB1, even a top 10 dynasty running back already. I've been impressed, but I'm not quite on board with that yet.
Mitchell is a fun player for sure in an offense that likes to feature players just like him in their backfield. So I actually struggled a little bit whether to put him in the tier above. I thought there was a case to be made at least to add him to names like Cam Akers and J.K. Dobbins, Antonio Gibson. But I settled in tier 4. Matt, you had Dylan and Mitchell. You also threw a few more names that we've already talked about, including Ezekiel Elliott. But one guy I really wanted to talk about was David Montgomery. He had another productive season. He helped dynasty managers win championships once again this year. And it seems like we're always a little low on him. He kicked off tier 5 for me, and I had a hard time deciding if he belonged in this tier. You decided he did.
Yeah, and this is just a rock solid volume based running back to play. That's really all it is with David Montgomery. We've seen his pass catching come up, transfer from last season when he went on that torrid 8-game streak to end the season. We've seen him remain, relatively healthy, and we've also seen him maintain almost 80% of the snap share from the running back position. It was really only Khalil Herbert here and there, Damian Williams in as a pass catcher, and who knows what's going to happen with Tarico and if he ever comes back. But it just seems to me he's got this role pretty much locked up. It's a very boring play, but if you want, consistent running back 2-level points with the occasional spike week, then I think Montgomery it fits with these players. He's got the volume. That's really the main argument for him, both in the receiving game and in the rushing game.
Before we get to the rest of the guys that you included, Matt, I wonder what your thought. The thing that kept me from putting Montgomery in tier 4, and obviously these are going to be fluid throughout the offseason. There's going to be a lot of changes to rankings and how we value these players. But I'm wondering what's going to happen in Chicago. Of course, Matt Nagy on the hot seat at the very, very least. In fact, before some of you listen to this, he may have been fired. So if Nagy moves on from Chicago and they go in a different direction in that offense, Montgomery strikes me as the type of player that if you didn't draft him, if you don't already love him, you might have a hard time falling in love with David Montgomery.
I don't know. I just think he's the boring, durable back that's going to. I mean, what are they really going to spend capital on a running back? Are they going to draft one of those top 2 guys? Are they going to sign someone major in free agency? Maybe, but they have so many other holes on that team outside of, they've got quarterback locked up and they have, one receiver with Darnell Mooney, really, right? Like, I guess you could say Cole Kmet is coming on. Those are going to be the 2 key pieces in their passing game. But I really feel like they have bigger, fish to fry. A new coaching staff coming in, like, is running back really going to be the position that they address? Maybe they like Khalil Herbert more, who has played fine, but I do think he's a priority add for really any dynasty team this offseason in case something does happen with Montgomery, like you're suggesting, or injuries or what have you, because he's shown, I think, that he can fulfill that role. So I don't know. I guess it's possible, but I just don't see a new coaching staff prioritizing running back on this team with so many other problems.
I do think Montgomery is a really interesting player. You think back to last year, and he ended on that crazy hot streak that Matt mentioned, and he became a player to talk about all last offseason. Was that the real David Montgomery, or should we be selling high? And really, no matter which side of that argument you were on, I kind of think you were right, because he's lost some dynasty value since the end of last offseason. But he also gave us 5 RB1 games, 4 RB2 games. He's been, like Matt said, rock solid.
He's been good, man.
Yeah, very good. And I maybe it's just the dynasty manager in me that says that if you didn't love him already, you're going to have a hard time falling in love with him, because I never was. And I feel like I've been wrong about him, that I wish I had him on teams because of all the production, but it still feels to me that you mentioned Herbert's name. An incoming coaching staff, I think it'd be easier to fall in love with that guy than it is with David Montgomery as your primary runner.
If like Miles Sanders or Clyde Edwards-Helaire had the production that David Montgomery had from a strictly fantasy points standpoint, we'd have them in tier 2.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Tier 3, maybe. Tier 3, I guess, maybe.
Matt, you and I both had Travis Etienne along with Mitchell and Dylan. You had those other names as well. Make your case for Travis Etienne, his upside down there in Jacksonville as a tier 4 running back.
Well, it was looking real bad for him when, James Robinson had an Achilles, it was looking bad for him from a standpoint of ever having the full-time role there. The team obviously is in shambles, but they fired the head coach problem. Hopefully they do not go and hire Bill O'Brien, which was, I think, rumored a couple of weeks ago. And this offense looks up, and without James Robinson there, Maybe they add another veteran. Maybe Melvin Gordon goes there to die. But I think Etienne now, as long as he can get over this foot issue, is probably going to have close to a locked in, at least the lead back in the committee kind of role now. Because does it really make sense for them to bring in a veteran? I know we can say that Jacksonville, many things they do don't make sense, but it just seems like a hard thing to really wrap my head around at this point. So it's based on upside. It's based on the player that we knew in college and the potential of the starter lead back role. That's really the crux of it, I guess.
Yeah, it didn't make sense to use your first rounder on a running back when you had James Robinson either, and they did that. And I feel like for the franchise as a whole, for Trevor Lawrence, for us as fans and fantasy players, Urban Meyer being gone is a good thing. Travis Etienne may be the one player that Meyer leaving really hurts, because we've seen him coach that style of player. Obviously, he thought and thinks very highly of him, spending that draft capital on him. And the injury he suffered is, we talk about the Cam Akers Achilles, but the foot injury that Etienne suffered is very serious on its own merit. And I don't know, he's in that next group with a lot of other players that have question marks. I still like the player, but Shad Khan, the owner, I do not trust. They're keeping apparently Trent Baalke. I certainly don't like that move. So even though the figurehead, the face of the organization is gone, there's still some questionable decision makers there in town.
Yeah, and who knows where that offseason is going to take the Jaguars. I wrote in the rookie report card that I still am willing to add Etienne, and that was even before the injury that boosted his value once again. Now that Robinson is on the shelf for at least most of next season, I'm like on the fence. I don't know which way to fall off on when it comes to Etienne. And I loved him coming out of college. I still think he can recover from this injury and be a dynamic tailback. I just don't know if I believe in what they're doing down there in Jacksonville. Once again, just like we said with all the other youth, the rest of the youth on that team, we really need the right coach in Jacksonville. So I'm looking forward to seeing what they end up doing at the head coach position. Tier 4 is in the books. We only landed on 3 players, guys. It was Elijah Mitchell, A.J. Dillon, and Travis Etienne, some young tailbacks that seem to be on the rise, guys that could jump up a tier or 2 in 2022. Tier 5 is a little bit different, Ryan. We got some aging veterans that have performed. We have some guys that have been around for a few years that have kind of disappointed, had high points, of course, but disappointed overall. I'm talking about Leonard Fournette, Clyde Edwards-Helaire, Miles Sanders, and Kareem Hunt. They're all consensus tier 5 guys. Fournette, clearly, since landing in Tampa Bay, he has overproduced expectation. He's been really, really good when he's been on the field. And then these younger tailbacks that are sharing the space, Edwards-Helaire and Kareem Hunt, even Miles Sanders, these guys, there's plenty of question marks with.
There certainly are, as I kind of mentioned earlier. But honestly, this is probably the tier where I'm going to be buying this offseason because the majority of them, outside of Fournette, obviously, the majority of them have lost dynasty value this season. Clyde Edwards-Helaire, Sanders, Kareem Hunt due to injury. So I'm going to be shopping in the bargain bin this offseason. Those are players, just like if you targeted Fournette a year ago, you got a nice return on investment. I still believe in the talent. There's some questions about the situation, at least in my opinion, with Sanders, certainly with Josh Jacobs. I don't know if you mentioned that name yet, but that's another player I put in this tier. But overall, I like the price of these guys right now.
Josh Jacobs has been a guy, Matt, that has kind of come on since the coaching change. There's been a little bit of a change in philosophy down there in Las Vegas late in the season. And you actually had him in tier 4, along with Etienne and A.J. Dillon and Elijah Mitchell. You're still holding on to that upside play that we had of him coming out of Alabama. What's keeping you high on his potential as he now goes into year 4, I guess it would be?
For me, it's just that, I mean, he's basically a slightly better version of David Montgomery. Like they're pretty much the same player to me. A reliable, rock solid running back too that are going to catch a few passes. And one of our concerns with Jacobs was that he wasn't being used as a pass catcher. As a pro, which was one of the things we were so excited about him when he was drafted. But he's only had 2 games this season with less than 3 targets, only 4 games with less than 3 catches. He's starting to come on in that role. Maybe that's because a little bit because of Kenyon Drake being injured and Jalen Richard being out. But he's maintained almost a 70% snap share all season long. And I think he's the same. Like I said, I feel about this basically the same about him as I do David Montgomery. He also finished as the running back 13 coming into week 18. So he's fine. He's a fine running back too, and for that I think he belongs with the group ahead of this, because I don't know if we can necessarily say the same for the rest of these guys in this tier outside of Leonard Fournette, who is a little bit older as well. Also, Josh Jacobs only going to be 24 at the end of next season. So. And after that, he may be on a new team, but still very young for how long he's been in the NFL and what he's put on the field so far.
Yeah, Jacobs is another guy that there's going to be some turnover down there in Vegas. We're going to see most likely a new coaching staff. We don't know what the future of Derek Carr is. They have other needs as well, and that offense has been really up and down throughout the season. Jacobs has been a part of that. It's just I wonder what exactly their plans are with Jacobs moving forward, because they'll have to make some decisions at that position within the next year or so. So tier 5 ends up being a tier of 6 players. We had Leonard Fournette, Clyde Edwards-Helaire, Miles Sanders, and Kareem Hunt. We also threw in David Montgomery and Josh Jacobs. Matt, you had a couple other names that I thought were pretty interesting here in tier 5. Younger guys, all 3 of them. Darrell Henderson, who tailed off this past season with the Rams. Michael Carter, the rookie who had his surges in our rankings throughout the year. And then Rashaad Penny, who blasted off late in the year. Talk about these guys.
Henderson, we started off the year as, felt like a back end running back 1, and he was while he was healthy. But as we've seen time and time again with him, he's not the lead back for an extended period of time kind of player. We saw Sony take over in that role when he got hurt. And next season, presumably we're going to see Cam Akers out there in the field, and Henderson will go back to being that complementary back of when he was productive in 2020 as well. So I like him there just fine. He doesn't quite fit as the bell cow as maybe Sanders could be, if Fournette certainly is. But I think he has enough upside to be in this tier. Michael Carter, we've seen up and down seasons. We saw the Jets still be terrible. Still don't know anything about what Zach Wilson's going to be as a quarterback. But he's got the youth. He catches passes, and he's got some untapped upside, I would say, behind him. And then Penny, he's a joke, but we've seen him reel off 4 out of his last 5 games have been over 135 rushing yards. He's rushed for 6 touchdowns over that span. So ending the season hot. We've seen players like this get hot at the end of the season before and then just become nothing next season. And that's possible with Penny. He'll probably be on a new team unless Seattle keeps Pete Carroll around, and then he'll probably want to resign Penny. I can't wait for the conversation of them getting rid of Russell Wilson but keeping Rashaad Penny. That should be a fun one. I don't know. I think we've seen enough upside for him to show that he has at least a ceiling when healthy, and that's something that combined with the draft capital, all that kind of stuff, I think is something we could say that for me puts him above that last tier of players that we'll talk about next.
Darrell Henderson is a guy that I'm deathly afraid of in Dynasty. Yeah. I traded him in the middle of the season. I couldn't rank him. In fact, I didn't have him even in tier 6, simply because Akers is going to be back. And I traded Darrell Henderson in the middle of the season after his big, most productive weeks, because, he never had a 100-yard game despite all those opportunities, always getting 15 to 25 opportunities in each game, and really didn't make the most of them. He was very touchdown dependent, 5 touchdowns in the first 7 games. And that's where those fantasy points were coming from. we fell into a trap a little bit, and I'm as guilty as anybody. I was the guy on the podcast before the season after the Akers injury saying that I would give up a future first round pick for Henderson. I think he could be a league winner. But as the season progressed, and after the Sony Michel trade, and after, especially once they started incorporating him even a little bit in the middle of the season, it felt like that coaching staff didn't want to trust Henderson with anything more than a secondary role as that pass catcher and that guy that can be a slasher in the middle of the field on as a change of pace type runner. So Henderson really scares me personally. I don't mind your ranking at all of Carter or Penny because both have the upside. I just think Henderson might not have that same amount of potential moving forward. In tier 6, let's jump over to tier 6. We had a handful of guys that were consensusly ranked here, including James Conner, Ramondre Stevenson, Chase Edmonds, and Devin Singletary. It's a unique group, I would say. There's a little bit of upside here, Ryan. There's some veterans that have played well as of late. Your overall thoughts on tier 6 and the guys that you ranked here, especially those guys that we all put in tier 6.
Obviously, we're to the just the depth stage of the rankings, and these are players that you want to have on your roster for bye weeks, for those flex spots, or in case of injuries. But don't want to necessarily count on these players every week, at least based on what we know right now. You mentioned some upside. We saw the touchdown upside from James Conner. He's a free agent. Chase Edmonds, his current teammate, also is a free agent. So there is some upside if you've got those guys on your roster. Each of them could potentially be worth quite a bit more this offseason as we see how free agency unwinds, and presumably they're not going to be teammates for much longer. So some chance for both of those guys to gain value.
After Connor and Edmonds, Stevenson, and Singletary, there's a few more names that we needed to consider. You already talked about Michael Carter and Rashaad Penny, Matt, but a couple other names you listed here include Tony Pollard and Damian Harris. Harris, of course, had a big season for the Patriots, but man, it's hard to get on board with him as a long-term dynasty asset. That's probably why he's down here.
Yeah, I hesitated to put him on here at all, and then I saw Ryan had him on there, and I was like, yeah, I guess you're right. He scored a bunch of touchdowns. So I guess he belongs, but he's going to be inconsistent, except for maybe around the goal line. And I think Stevenson can fill that role should they decide they want to rely on one back more. So I think Stevenson certainly has more upside. Harris is shown that he is not a pass catcher, at least in that offense. And, presumably James White is going to be back and be catching passes again. I'm not sure of his contract status off the top of my head. So it's a crowded backfield. I think Stevenson has the most upside, and Harris is kind of the boring, if he doesn't get a touchdown, then you're probably sad you started him.
So you feel better about Stevenson at this point?
I do. Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe it's the untapped potential. I don't know.
Would you make that trade? Would you trade Harris for Stevenson?
Oh, easily.
Yeah.
I would.
Harris got so many, they have the trust, he has the trust of that coaching staff right now. And I know Singletary was impressive, or Stevenson, excuse me, was impressive, but throughout the season, but man, Harris is the guy that they wanted on the field clearly over him. Maybe that'll change going into year 2 for Stevenson.
I think it depends on what you're looking for out of the players. If you're looking for, someone you can plug in and get some points from, right, and that's all you need. If you're starting Damian Harrison as your running back 2, then you're probably not a super strong competitor unless you're just stacked out everywhere else, right? So if he's that kind of player for you, if you need one of them to be that kind of player, then I think Harris is the play. But if it's kind of a luxury pick, a depth kind of piece, I'd rather just take the upside with Stevenson, I think.
Sure, that makes sense. One other name we should bring up here, Ryan, I guess maybe a couple names. Sony Michel had a resurgence in LA, but should be a free agent this offseason. We'll see what happens there. And then your thoughts on Tony Pollard down there in Dallas, a guy with upside, but is a backup, really.
Yeah, Dane, you've said this about Pollard before. I can't remember if you've said it on the show or just in our conversations, that you like the talent. You just don't know that he's the type of player who can handle the backfield on his own. And a lot of the things that you guys were saying about Darrell Henderson, I thought about Pollard. So I like Pollard a lot. I think you can start him in that flex spot, that last flex spot occasionally. But I don't think he's taking over for Zeke anytime soon. And I think when they do move on from Zeke, it will either be a committee or they'll bring in someone else. I really like the talent. I think he's great from an NFL perspective, a great player and weapon for the Cowboys. I don't think he's ever going to be that RB1 in Dynasty. And, like he's already 25 years old, I believe. I think that's right. So we're just, we chase these backups sometimes and we just do it their entire career and then they're gone. They never actually produce.
So tier 6 ends up being James Conner, Ramondre Stevenson, Chase Edmonds, Devin Singletary, Michael Carter, Sony Michel, Rashaad Penny, Damian Harris, and Tony Pollard. Those aren't in any particular order. Guys, we didn't mention a handful of names that we probably would end up in the next tier. We'd talk about them very soon, including James Robinson and Melvin Gordon, Cordero Patterson, the guy that really produced this season, but I don't think the expectation is all that high moving forward. Also, Alexander Madison, Chris Carson, Jamal Williams up there in Detroit. So there's a handful more names, Myles Gaskin, Nyheim Hines, and the list rolls on and on. Guys that are going to be depth pieces on other rosters throughout your league, and certainly guys worth a roster spot, but we didn't have time to necessarily talk about today. Last thing for each of you. Ryan, is there a guy that you're buying, considering these prices and ADP and all those things we talk about all the time? Is there a running back you really want to buy this offseason as of right now?
I think my answer would have to be Zeke. As you mentioned earlier in the show, he's in my top 10 dynasty running backs. Our latest ADP has him as the RB 18. There's certainly some negative sentiments about him based on what we've seen this season. So I would want to take advantage of that. I think he's at least in that mix with those other players we talked about. Beyond that, it's kind of the tier of players that I talked about. I believe it was tier 5, those players that have lost value this offseason. Clyde Edwards-Helaire, Miles Sanders, Kareem Hunt, even Aaron Jones, even though I was had him further ranked down the list than you guys did. Those are players I would be targeting.
Matt, is your guy going to be CMC, or are you going to aim a little bit lower as your main addition this year?
I mean, I think it's probably CMC if I can get a discount, but honestly, the answer is none of these guys really until we get to like August, September, early September. Honestly, I just don't think it's worth investing in running backs for a while unless you can get them at a steep discount. Maybe you can get that Kamara, Cook, Henry, Barkley, Chubb kind of tier because they're on the cusp of hitting that not necessarily the age cliff in terms of their production, but in terms of how the community typically values those kinds of players. For like stashes, I might want to take some shots trying to get mentioned Khalil Herbert earlier, maybe Jarrett Patterson, some depth guys like that could whose value could rise significantly if something did happen to the starter in front of them before the start of next season. So in general, I'm not paying any premiums for any running backs right now, and honestly, I'd probably be on the other side of that, and then maybe try to buy back in closer to the start of the season.
For me, the biggest lesson I really learned this year was there were a handful of veteran running backs that I liked this year, and I just wasn't willing to pay the second round pick or sometimes even like a couple thirds. And they came through, the main one being Leonard Fournette. I really liked the idea of him in Tampa Bay once again coming into this past season. I just didn't capitalize enough. And the guy who sticks out to me is the same type of player right now is James Conner down there in Arizona. It really feels to me like this wasn't a fluke. He stayed healthy. He was very productive, both as a pass catcher and as a runner between the tackles. And he's one of those guys that can have the role all over the field. He could be on the field on third down. I feel like he's going to end up back in Arizona. That's a offense I want to invest in. So for me, it's going to be James Conner. I think there's going to be a discount with free agency looming and a lot of unknowns surrounding him. Even if he moves on to another team, it feels to me like he's one of the top 20 talented running backs in the NFL. And because he's going to be 27, us dynasty managers won't really like him. I think that's going to do it for this week's episode of the DLF Dynasty podcast. We're going to do wide receivers next week. So that'll be a fun conversation. We'll get through as many tiers as we can. As I mentioned in the lead, got a lot of fun stuff coming up. Episode 500 is right around the corner. We're talking like NFC Championship week, AFC and NFC Championship week. We'll release that one. And then some fun changes that I think all of our listeners are going to enjoy as well. For Matt and Ryan, I'm Dan. Thanks for listening to this episode of the DLF Dynasty podcast. We'll catch you again next week.